morning. We will continue with our Booker Prize winning novel, The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, published in 1989. Now, when we were talking about the book last time, we talked about the key ideas or the key words to understand the remains of the day. And one is repression and self-denial. The hero, Mr. Stevens, a butler in a great household, Darlington Hall, which belongs to Lord Darlington, he is so consumed by his desire to be a professional, to be a consummate butler, that he never bothers about what he wants, about his own desires. It is always what is expected of him, what his employer expects of him. So, in the process of fulfilling his master's wishes and desires, he resorts to repressing and suppressing his own desires, his own wishes, and even his own beliefs and convictions. And this is the basic idea of the remains of the day. The butler in fact remains a metaphor for those who remain unwaveringly loyal or unwaveringly unquestioning towards their so called masters or social and political superiors. So, this is one of the underlying ideas of the remains of the day, which talks about how, to what extent, to what lengths people can go or should go to maintain the so called social equilibrium. Another question in the novel is that is raised in the novel is the idea or the question of dignity. Now, when we were talking about the question of dignity, we saw how there was a Hayes society which defined what dignity is, and the membership was so exclusive that they would the society would admit only those butlers who belong to the so called extremely distinguished households. Now, there is a lot of debating on this issue or matter of dignity, and Stevens observes that dignity is a very fuzzy term. It's a very hard to define expression. No one really knows what true or great dignity is, although one can easily define what are the great households, people who are born aristocrats or who have generations of wealth and social prestige associated to them. But a great butler is someone who has that elusive quality of acting or rather displaying grace under pressure. And then he talks, I am on page 61, let me make a reference to what he says. It was completely contrary to Lord Darlington's natural tendencies to take such public stances as he came to do, and I can say with conviction that his lordship was persuaded to overcome his more retiring side only through a deep sense of moral duty. Whatever may be said about his lordship these days, and the great majority of it is, as I say, utter nonsense, I can declare that he was a truly good man at heart, a gentleman through and through, and one I am today proud to have given my best years of service to. Now, we also talked about the entire idea of Stevens being an unreliable narrator. Now, what does that mean? Why can't we trust Stevens as a narrator, although we have only his voice? We just pay attention that he is the only one whose voice or whose point of view we actually get to find in the remains of the day. He is the narrator, his is the voice that we hear. So, what makes him an unreliable narrator? The fact that he is consistently repressing and suppressing his true nature, he is steadfastly denying himself all his pleasures and joys and happiness of life, because he professes to claim that ideal, or he desires to attain that ideal of dignity, which makes him lead him to join the that very exclusive, very minor circle of butlers who could really be defined as truly great. And therefore, in denying himself, in suppressing his true nature, in conforming to what is expected of him or what the society expects of someone like Stevens, he becomes an unreliable narrator. So, when we see him talking about what people say about Lord Darlington and the way he justifies or defends his former master, former because it is established at the beginning that Darlington Hall now belongs to an American gentleman, Mr. Faraday. Lord Darlington is no longer there, but Stevens still continues as the head butler of that great household. So, what I can declare that he was a truly good man at heart, a gentleman through and through, and one I am today proud to have given my best years of service to. The idea is that there are people who now condemn or who now question Lord Darlington about several things that he has been involved in. His role in history, for example, is one such issue, one such major issue of contention. People talk and not always well of Lord Darlington, and that is what bothers Mr. Stevens. Even today he is extremely loyal to his former master. So, we were talking about Genet's stylistic devices of order and duration, and again we are now told much before what really happens that Lord Darlington died unsung. Okay, Lord Darlington is no longer what he used to be. So, this is again, as the title itself reflects, the remains of the days. So, the remains of the days basically remains a novel which talks about losses. There are several such losses in the novel, and the loss of Lord Darlington's reputation, his former prestige, his former place in society is also one of the great losses that Stevens laments about and reflects over. Page 63. We are still on now as he reminisces about Lord Darlington while still in Salisbury. Remember his motoring tour across the British countryside, and Lord Darlington, I should say, had actually witnessed my father's fall of a week or so earlier. Miss Kenton has been worried about old Mr. Stevens's state of health. She also points out very brusquely that Mr. Stevens is not what he used to be, and Mr. Stevens the junior should relieve his father of his duties as an under butler, which Mr. Stevens is too proud to acknowledge. So, this gives you another glimpse into Mr. Stevens' character, that he is too proud. He never acknowledges his mistakes and faults. So, a man who does not acknowledge his own faults, isn't it rather too much to expect that he would question or he would find faults with his employer Lord Darlington, whom he is so loyal to or whom he is so devoted to. Okay. So, that entire idea of living in denial, self denial, as well as in refusing to see where the fault exactly lies in himself as well as in Lord Darlington. So, page 63, Lord Darlington, I should say, had actually witnessed my father's fall of a week or so earlier. His lordship had been entertaining two guests, a young lady and gentleman, in the summer house, and had watched my father's approach across the lawn bearing a much welcome tray of refreshments. The lawn climbs a slope several yards in front of the summer house, and in those days as today, 4 flagstones embedded into the grass served as steps by which to negotiate this climb. It was in the vicinity of these steps that my father fell, scattering the load on his tray, teapot, cups, saucers, sandwiches, cakes, across the area of grass at the top of the steps. So, this is a calamity. For others it may be just another mishap, an old man unable to negotiate his way up the stairs, but in Lord Darlington's great household this is nothing short of a disaster, and that too in front of a company of guests. So, Miss Kenton's prophecies at last come true, that old Mr. Stevens indeed deserves a much needed rest, because he has sort of become an embarrassment to Lord Darlington and the establishment. And then we are told that Mr. Stevens the younger, he is compelled to rephrase his father's duties or reschedule his father's duties, and he is no longer given the responsibilities and charges that he was given earlier. And in this also we realize that what kind of relationship is shared between the father and the son. I will just read you a couple of lines. Mr. Stevens comes straight to his father's room, the quarters. I have come here to relate something to you, father. Then relate it briefly and concisely. I have not all morning to listen to your chatter. In that case, father, I will come straight to the point. Since you wish me to be brief, I will do my best to comply. The fact is, father has become increasingly infirm, so much so that even the duties of an under butler are now beyond his capabilities. His lordship is of the view, as indeed I am myself, that while father is allowed to continue with his present round of duties, he represents an ever present threat to the smooth running of this household, and in particular to next week's important international gathering. Principally, it has been felt that father should no longer be asked to wait at table, whether or not guests are present. Now, look at the very formal and very detached tone and manner in which the father and the son hold this conversation. And nowhere does he refer to his father as you, or with actual affection, although there is lot of affection between the two men, as we will later see. But at this point it's he addresses him extremely formally, again as we have been seeing the entire idea of repression of emotions, because one is not supposed to reveal, one is not supposed to express emotions, because that is taken as a sign of weakness of character. Page 67. In fact, I can describe his manner at that moment no better than the way Miss Kenton puts it in her letter. It was indeed as though he hoped to find some precious jewel he had dropped there. So, it is like father, once he is reassigned his duties, he starts walking around extremely carefully. He looks, he just stares at the ground below, at the floor, and never looks up. Okay. And as Miss Kenton later describes old Mr. Stevens, that the way he walked was as though he hoped to find some precious jewels he had dropped there. And again this becomes a symbol, this precious jewel, what could it be? It's those lost times which will never come back, the times of old prestige, and when Mr. Stevens was at his peak, and at his peak of his prestige and the so called dignity, and which he knows that it has been lost forever. Page 69. But I feel, it is at the bottom, but I feel I should return just a moment to the matter of my father, for it strikes me I may have given the impression earlier that I treated him rather bluntly over his declining abilities. The fact is, there was little choice but to approach the matter as I did, as I am sure you will agree once I have explained the full context of those days. So, now we are told what was so important about those days, why was it so pertinent that old Mr. Stevens should be reassigned his duties. That is to say, the important international conference to take place at Darlington Hall was by then looming ahead of us, leaving little room for indulgence or beating about the bush. It is important to be reminded, moreover, that although Darlington Hall was to witness many more events of equal gravity over the 15 or so years that followed, that conference of March 1923. So, again that conference of March 1923, there are repeated reference to that particular event. Again, think Gerard Genet's idea of order and duration, where an event is so important that before it actually happens, there are multiple references to it just because of its magnitude. Okay. And this frequent repetitions and references add that a touch of that much needed gravitas to the event, that it was actually or really an event that was so important to everyone concerned. So, the event of March 1923 was the first one of them. One supposes, relatively inexperienced and inclined to leave little to chance. In fact, I often look back to that conference and for more than one reason regard it as a turning point in my life. For one thing, I suppose I do regard it as the moment in my career when I truly came of age as a butler. So, this is a point when he realizes that he has almost touched upon the highest standards of perfection in his profession. Okay, he has almost joined the ranks of the great butlers in the history of United Kingdom, and he feels that March 1923, the conference period, was one such time when he was at the peak of his powers, when he truly came of age as a butler. See, there are also undercurrents of irony and humor, although the humor is not very boisterous, but there is also a sense, a very right touch of humor, that someone would be so proud of his ability to serve serve people, okay, and therefore coming of age as a butler is something to be proud of. It may not be for someone who is growing up in current generation, but we are talking about 1920s, and it also reflects on the social and political climate of those days. That is not to say I consider I became necessarily a great butler. It is hardly for me in any case to make judgments of this sort, but should it be that anyone ever wish to posit that I have attained at least a little of that crucial quality of dignity in the course of my career, such a person may wish to be directed towards that conference of March 1923 as representing the moment when I first demonstrated I might have a capacity for such a quality. It was one of those events which, at a crucial stage in one's development, arrive to challenge and stretch one to the limit of one's ability and beyond, so that thereafter one has new standards by which to judge oneself. That conference was also memorable, of course, for other quite separate reasons, as I would like now to explain. Now, in describing repeatedly the magnitude of the conference, Ishiguro is also raising our expectations, is also raising building up the suspense, what actually happened, okay, why was it so important, and um, what what did Stevens exactly do so that now as he looks back on his career as a butler, he regards March 1923 as the height of his success, when he was at the pinnacle of his professionalism. That conference was also memorable, of course, for other quite separate reasons, as I would like now to explain. So, now we actually see what happened. The conference of 1923 was the culmination of long planning on the part of Lord Darlington. Indeed, in retrospect, one can clearly see how his lordship had been moving towards this point from some 3 years or so before. As I recall, he had not been initially so preoccupied with the peace treaty when it was drawn up at the end of the Great War. We are talking about the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and Lord Darlington is an employee of the British government in the foreign services, and he must be one of those elite few who drew up the Treaty of Versailles, where the point where Germany was heavily defeated and was at the mercy of the Allies. So, it was that at that point that Lord Darlington started working immediately after the First World War. And I think it is fair to say that his interest was prompted not so much by an analysis of the treaty, but by his friendship with Herr Karl-Heinz Bremen. Okay, so, there is one German gentleman who was a very good friend of Lord Darlington, and the idea is that Lord Darlington, who was an Englishman, a very honorable and decent English nobleman, he made great friends with Mr. Bremen, a German, someone who represents a defeated country. And later that it is realized that the Treaty of Versailles was so humiliating for the German people, and particularly for Mr. Bremen, that he ends up shooting himself, because he holds himself responsible for the humiliation that his country suffered by signing that treaty. So, Lord Darlington, moved by Mr. Bremen's suicide and also driven by his own sense of decency, he plans a conference where Germany can be given some sort of respite. So, it's a conference, it's an event of great magnitude, where events or decisions of monumental importance would be taken. And where does that leave our butler friend Mr. Stevens? At the center of things, because after all he is going to manage the household where the conference is going to take place. So, Lord Darlington may be an important man, but the butler is going to run the show along with the household, and therefore, he is no less important. We come to page 73. It was a little later that same night that his lordship, that is Lord Darlington, said with some gravity, shaking his head, "I fought that war to preserve justice in this world. As far as I understood, I was not taking part in a vendetta against the German race." So, this is what the treaty appears to be, a sort of a vendetta. Okay, Lord Darlington's intentions are totally honorable, and his intentions or his willingness, his decision to help Germany has been spurred on by the suicide of his very dear friend and associate Mr. Bremen. So, now again memory, the remains of the day is a novel about memory, of memory, and then at this point Stevens reflects back again. And when today one hears talk about his lordship, when one hears the sort of foolish speculations concerning his motives, as one does all too frequently these days, I am pleased to recall the memory of that moment as he spoke those heartfelt words in the near empty banqueting hall. Whatever complications arose in his lordship's course over subsequent years, I for one will never doubt that a desire to see justice in this world lay at the heart of all his actions. It was not long after that evening there came the sad news that Herr Bremen had shot himself in a train between Hamburg and Berlin. Naturally, his lordship was greatly distressed and immediately made plans to dispatch funds and commiserations to Frau Bremen. However, after several days of endeavor, in which I myself did best to assist, his lordship was not able to discover the whereabouts of any of Herr Bremen's family. He had, it seemed, been homeless for some time, and his family dispersed. So, this is the reason that motivates Lord Darlington to help the German nation. Page 77. So, as the days of conference come nearby, this is what Stevens tells us, that tells us that this is what he was doing. Thus set about preparing for the days ahead, as I imagine general might prepare for a battle. I devised with utmost care a special staff plan anticipating all sorts of eventualities. I analyzed where our weakest points lay and set about making contingency plans to fall back upon in the event of these points giving way. I even gave the staff a military style pep talk, impressing upon them that for all their having to work at an exhausting rate, they could feel great pride in discharging their duties over the days that lay ahead. History could well be made under this roof, I told them, and they, knowing me to be one not prone to exaggerated statements, well understood that something of an extraordinary nature was impending. Now, again, this is yet another instance of exaggeration. History would be made under this roof. There is a sense of too much or excessive self-importance in both Lord Darlington as well as Stevens. They consider themselves, or they take themselves too seriously. It is not like a group of people can mold or inform the destiny of Europe, but this is what they take themselves for, that they are going to play a very significant part in the history of those times. And at this also Ishiguro hints appears a little ridiculous to assume this sense of self-importance. Page 93, where we are told that amidst all these preparations, because now the conference is in full swing and people of great importance have arrived to Darlington Hall to discuss the issue of how much respite should Germany be given. So, at the core of it is the discussion of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. So, while all these activities are going on and there is so much of hustle and bustle in the household, senior Mr. Stevens falls seriously ill. Remember, he has already been ill. He was not in the best of health. He is 72 years old, and then maybe all this workload and activities, they do not agree with him, and he falls ill. So, what happens then? We are told that he just keels over, and his eyes were closed, his face was an ashen color, and there were beads of sweat on his forehead. Further assistance was called, a bath chair arrived in due course, and my father was transported up to his room. Once my father had been laid in his bed, it was a little uncertain as to how to proceed, because Stevens bears on his shoulders the weight of the world. He is extremely aware of the monumental task that that is spread in front of Lord Darlington, and he wishes to serve his master in to the best of his capacity. So, even at the risk of neglecting his own father, because that is what has been ingrained in him from the beginning by his father, that one must do one's duties to perfection, and therefore, the kind of pride that Mr. Stevens takes in his profession, it prevents him from taking more emotional decisions like looking after his father. Once my father had been laid in his bed, I was a little uncertain as to how to proceed. For while it seemed undesirable that I leave my father in such a condition, I did not really have a moment more to spare. As I stood hesitating in the doorway, Miss Kenton appeared at my side and said, "Mr. Stevens, I have a little more time than you at the moment. I shall, if you wish, attend to your father. I shall show Dr. Meredith up and notify you if he has anything noteworthy to say." So, Miss Kenton, who was quite miffed with Mr. Stevens and his overbearing ways, she proves to be a person with a real emotional core, because why she understands, although she understands Mr. Stevens' situation also, she knows how devoted he is to his duties and to Lord Darlington, and therefore she says that she is going to look after his father while he can go and attend to his duties. "Thank you, Miss Kenton," I said, and took my leave. So, again, as we talk about the entire idea of self deception, all under the garb of unquestioning loyalty, and all this to just preserve or to uphold the notion of dignity, all this at what cost? At the cost of one's own real feelings and emotions and relationships. When I returned to the drawing room, a clergyman was talking about the hardships being suffered by children in Berlin. I immediately found myself more than occupied replenishing the guests with tea and coffee. A few of the gentlemen I noticed were drinking spirits, and one or two, despite the presence of the two ladies, had started to smoke. I was, I recall, leaving the drawing room with an empty teapot in my hand when Miss Kenton stopped me and said, "Mr. Stevens, Dr. Meredith is just leaving now." As she said this, I could see the doctor putting on his mackintosh and hat in the hall, and so went to him, the teapot still in my hand. The doctor looked at me with a disgruntled expression. "Your father is not so good," he said. "If he deteriorates, call me again immediately." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Okay, that's all that comes out of Mr. Stevens, so preoccupied with discharging his duties. We'll move on to page 104. And now we find the cook, Mrs. Mortimer, who again comes back and informs Mr. Stevens that his father is really going very bad. "Oh, Mr. Stevens," she said upon our entry, "is gone very poorly." Indeed, my father's face had gone a dull reddish color, like no color I had seen on a living being. I heard Miss Kenton say softly behind him, "His pulse is very weak." I gazed at my father for a moment, touched his forehead slightly, then withdrew my hand. "In my opinion," Mrs. Mortimer said, "he has suffered a stroke. This is most distressing. Nevertheless, I must now return downstairs." So, this is what he calls grace under pressure, courage under suffering. Okay, and this is what he has been trained to do, and while he performs his duties amidst such severe personal trauma, he actually takes great pride in what he is doing. "Of course, Mr. Stevens, I will tell you when the doctor arrives, or else when there are any changes." "Thank you, Miss Kenton." I hurried down the stairs and was in time to see the gentlemen proceeding into the smoking room. The footman looked relieved to see me, and I immediately signalled them to get to their positions. Whatever had taken place in the banqueting hall after my departure, there was now a genuinely celebratory atmosphere among the guests. All around the smoking room, gentlemen seemed to be standing in clusters, laughing and clapping each other on the shoulder. Mr. Lewis, Mr. Lewis's character is also very important. He represents the United States of America, and the United States of America had also played a very important role in the First World War and in the Treaty of Versailles. So, now when a discussion is in progress about reviewing the treaty, we have the character of Mr. Lewis, who later we will know plays a very important part in the whole situation. Mr. Lewis, so far as I could ascertain, had already retired. I found myself making my way through the guests, a bottle of port upon my tray. I had just finished serving a glass to a gentleman when a voice behind me said, "Ah, Stevens, you are interested in fish, you say?" I turned to find the young Mr. Cardinal beaming happily at me. I smiled also and said, "Fish, sir? When I was young, I used to keep all sorts of tropical fish in a tank. Quite a little aquarium it was." "I say, Stevens, are you all right?" I smiled again. "Quite all right, sir, thank you." I felt something touch my elbow and turned to find Lord Darlington. "Stevens, are you all right?" "Yes, sir, perfectly. You look as though you are crying." I laughed and taking out a handkerchief, quickly wiped my face. "I am very sorry, sir. The strains of a hard day." So consumed is Stevens by his professional duties that he is totally unaccepting of his grief. He does not accept his grief or admit his grief even to himself, okay, leave alone confiding in a friend. So, at the end of the novel, that is what we find, that he is left with no real friends, only memories of a profession, a great profession, a great career indeed, but no real emotional attachments. That is because he himself wanted his life this way. So, in his inability or inability to confess to himself his own real emotions, he becomes an unreliable narrator. So, when he this can also be seen in the political context. When he defends Lord Darlington's position, we cannot trust him or we cannot rely on him completely, because we know that here we are looking at a person who has not been true to his own nature, who has refused to accept the true nature of his employee out of unwavering loyalty and sense of duty. So, therefore, Stevens is an unreliable narrator. We move on to page 109. We find that much to everyone's dismay, old Mr. Stevens passes away, and although Stevens is attending to his guests' needs and trying to conduct small talk with all the guests in the Darlington Hall, he leaves his own father unattended, unattended in the sense that although there is Miss Kenton and the doctor is there to look after him, still he is not there in person to see his father during his dying moments, and this is something that he had to learn to live with. But in spite of the tragedy, he looks back at the entire event with great pride, as we are told at the beginning that this was a time when he feels that he had reached or almost touched that precious quality of dignity and of what it actually means to be a great butler. So, after his father's death, of course, it is not for me to suggest that I am worthy of ever being placed alongside the likes of the great butlers of our generation, such as Mr. Marshall or Mr. Lane. So, look at the number of times he refers to Mr. Marshall and Mr. Lane, the great butlers, and who defines them or who ranks these butlers. These very elitist kind of magazines like like the Hayes Society, okay, and the kind of newsletters they run. So, it is there that these people are admired and they are ranked as the great ones. And look at the number of times he refers to these great ones, and he also very modestly proclaims that I am not suggesting that I am worthy of ever being placed alongside these great personages. That means at the bottom of his heart, somewhere in his mind, there is this uh, desire to equal these greats, to join the ranks of these the so called great and dignified butlers. Though it should be said, there are those who perhaps out of misguided generosity tend to do just this. They say that, he says that there are some people who actually believe that I am one of the last great butlers of this generation, but I think this is they are being magnanimous. Stevens himself is being very modest. It could even be a case of fake or false modesty, but then he does not want to say so himself that he was a great butler. Let me make clear that when I say the conference of 1923 and that night in particular constituted a turning point in my professional development, I am speaking very much in terms of my own more humble standards. Even so, if you consider the pressures contingent on me that night, you may not think I delude myself unduly if I go so far as to suggest that I did perhaps display in the face of everything, at least in some modest degree, a dignity worthy of someone like Mr. Marshall, or come to that, my father. Indeed, why should I deny it? For all its sad associations, whenever I recall that evening today, I find I do so with a large sense of triumph. So, this again, while choosing this elusive quality of or chasing this elusive quality of dignity, he deceives himself, he denies himself the way, the basic emotions, the basic human feelings, the basic joys of life, and this is a consistent feature of Stevens' life. Okay, in order to be the ultimate in dignity and professionalism, he ceases to be a true human being. So, therefore, he is, as we have been talking about all this while, that what makes Mr. Stevens an unreliable narrator is because precisely this reason, that a person who is not true to his own feelings, who lives in a state of denial, cannot be trusted entirely. We move on to next chapter, that is day 2, afternoon, Mortimer's Pond, Dorset. And then there is a lovely little description of the the English countryside. Eventually, however, after some searching, I found a sign post to Mortimer's Pond, and so it was that I arrived here at this spot a little over half an hour ago. I now find myself much indebted to the batman, for quite aside from assisting with the ford, he has allowed me to discover a most charming spot which it is most improbable I would ever have found otherwise. The pond is not a large one, a quarter of a mile around its perimeter perhaps, so that by stepping out to any promontory, one can command a view of its entirety. An atmosphere of great calm pervades here. Trees have been planted all around the water, just closely enough to give a pleasant shade to the banks, while here and there clusters of tall reeds and bulrushes break the water surface and its still reflection of the sky. So, landscape is also calm and peaceful and very serene, almost what Mr. Stevens actually is on the surface, extremely calm, full of restraint and understated dignity. So, this is what he admires. So, perhaps this kind of an English countryside becomes a metaphor for Mr. Stevens' temperament. Okay. The external reflects the internal, that he is like this largely because of his time and of his um, circumstances, the environment around him. So, we are not given to wild emotions, the raging passions. Okay. The nature itself is so. So, how can human beings give themselves to their desires? My footwear is not so much as to permit me easily to walk around the perimeter. I can see even from where I now sit the path disappearing into areas of deep mud, but I will say that such is the charm of this spot that on first arriving I was sorely tempted to do just that. Only the thought of the possible catastrophes that might befall such an expedition and of sustaining damaging to my travelling suit persuaded me to content myself with sitting here on this bench. And now look here, this is a beautiful sentence which sort of gives you the key to Mr. Stevens' character. He is not the kind of man who wants to come out of his comfort zone. Okay. There is a beautiful area surrounding the lake, but it is slightly muddy, and Mr. Stevens is not the kind of person who would like even a little bit of damage, a little bit of sand on his clothes or mud on his clothes. So, while he would like to do that, so it is basically a glimpse of his character. He is not the kind of person who would ever take any risk. Okay. The risk, because he has been brainwashed, and he has been so conditioned, or he has conditioned himself to live in a state of denial, to deny himself the basic joys. Walking around a pond barefooted is a very simple basic joy of life, that he denies himself even this much because it would sully or spoil his travelling suit. So, how do you expect such a man to plunge into something as wild as an emotional relationship? And he is not the kind of person who would do that. It is no doubt the quiet of these surroundings that has enabled me to ponder all the more thoroughly these thoughts which have entered my mind over this past half hour or so. Indeed, but for the tranquillity of the present setting, it is possible I would not have thought a great deal further about my behavior during my encounter with the Batman. That is to say, I may not have thought further why it was that I had given the distinct impression I had never been in the employ of Lord Darlington. For surely there is no real doubt that is what occurred. He had asked, "You mean you actually used to work for that Lord Darlington?" And I had given an answer which could mean little other than that I had not. It could simply be that a meaningless whim had suddenly overtaken me at that point. This is the whole point, is that a traveller asks Mr. Stevens where he comes from, and when Stevens admits that he comes from the great Darlington Hall, he asks him if he was ever in the service of the great Lord Darlington, and our unreliable narrator says that he is actually in the employment of one Mr. Faraday. So, why does he deny? Why does he deny that he has ever been in the employment of Lord Darlington, in spite of having such great affection and such a great sense of loyalty towards his former employee? He does not even acknowledge the presence of Lord Darlington in his life. So, perhaps what we are witnessing is a deep seated kind of a resentment against Lord Darlington, but which Stevens, being what he is too scared to even admit or to confront. So, what it is, we will continue in our next class. Thank you very much.